Richard, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Long time no see.
It's been awfully long, Frida.
Okay, since Friday anyway.
Uh-huh.
What we usually do with LinkedIn Live is we wait for a while before people join us, and it's also, I guess, people just had their makan after the buka
Yes.
puasa, so people got to take a bit of time before they actually join us. And I just have to ask you the very important Malaysian question: Is sudah makan?
Sudah.
Sudah, well done. I like your background, Richard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of effort to get this pink. No, it's literally me just pushing a button. I've got these very fancy lighting
Right.
rig set up. Yeah.
The mood lights for tonight's discussion.
I think it suits perfectly.
Right. Okay.
But if
Anyway,
you do fancy a mood change, just let me know and I can, happily
okay.
kind of, yeah.
While we're waiting for people to join, why
Hmm.
don't you put on show me the variety?
I'm going to have to go over there to grab my phone.
Oh,
You do realize that now. I should have just kept my mouth shut, shouldn't I? No, let's stick with the pink for now, the pink and the purple.
okay.
That is the mood set for the evening.
Okay. How many varieties do you have? Like you've got your pink, you've got your what?
Any color, any color. I can change it to any color, and I
Wow,
can
this
I
is
can have it flashing, flashing and all of that kind of stuff. It's
all right,
yeah.
all right. Okay, so while waiting for people to join as well, just to get people to understand the basis of why we've gotten together, why I've gotten Richard Bradbury here with me today, and of course, feel free to chat with us if you've just joined us.
Hmm.
Chat with us. We can ask us questions. We don't have the answers. We're not experts in this area, but we just love your thoughts and your feedback. So, as I was sharing with everyone that it was World Health Day on April 7th, which was last Thursday, and when we talk about health, right, it's such a huge part of sustainability, right?
Hmm.
And it's SDG 11 talks about sustainable cities and communities, and I want to expand on that and say sustainable smoke-free cities and communities, because I think this is something of concern here, not just in Malaysia but a global thing as well, as we try to, I guess, be a little bit more healthy.
Mm.
So anyway, I've got my friend here and someone that I work with. And the reason I've gotten him is, because this is something, I guess, how does it affect the average person? How does it affect the average man or the average Joe? And in this case, Richard Bradbury,
The average rich.
the average rich, right?
Mm.
And also, I guess, like from a user's point of view, and I'm just saying this because I know that you used to smoke and
Hmm.
everything, right? And
Hmm.
that's in the conventional sense, as in cigarettes. But then, of course, that has changed, and so this is the reason why we just got it together. And I want to know what it means as we work towards sustainable cities and communities. How is that going to change? Yeah. So anyway, I've got my first question for you, Richard, because and the reason I also got you on is because you've lived in several countries, right? And
Yep.
you would have seen it panned out differently in different countries. And I've got to start with, I guess, where you were born, and that
Hmm.
was in the UK. And you, after that, you lived in China, and of course now in Malaysia for over 10 years now.
Yep.
And so let's talk about you growing up in the UK. It won't be a long session as we talk about Richard's growing up. Yes, but when you talk about UK, right? And you think
Mm.
of the pub, right? And during
Mhm.
that period, and that equates to a smoky place, right? What was that like growing up? Just everybody goes to the pub, and it's a family thing, and smoke everywhere.
It's funny that this is the question that you start with. I mean, a
Mm,
friend of mine very recently was asking for some pictures of my late father because they're getting married, and he was a big part of their life. And so I was going through some of the older pictures from like the mid and early '80s, and
mhm.
I found a picture of one of my birthday parties. With the kids in the front and all of the adults in the back, and there's a cake at the front, and every single one of the adults in the background had a cigarette in their hand, right? And you can even see on the photograph the amount of smoke that's in the air.
Right,
It was everywhere, Frida. You would get on buses, and single decker buses would have non-smoking at the front and they would have smoking at the back. You would
right,
have double decker buses and it was smoking upstairs and it was non-smoking downstairs.
right.
But like you say, in a pub, it was just everywhere. It
Mm,
was, you would have smoking and non-smoking tables, which were identified by a little sign on the table that would say no smoking. but then people would just pick up that sign and move it somewhere else so they could sit at that table and smoke. So it kind of negated the whole point. Everywhere you went within the UK, in every pub, people
Right.
were smoking. It was just the norm, and it was so different back then
Right.
that I can't even imagine now it ever going back to anything like that. And however we managed to get through the 80s and 90s relatively unscathed, I have no idea. And
How
yeah,
how we live to tell the tale.
yeah,
Right.
it was just it was a little bit crazy. But yeah, my childhood, everywhere that I went, I remember people just smoking everywhere. Friends' houses, families' houses, neighbors, relatives. Everybody I knew almost had a cigarette or was smoking at that time.
Right, we've got Captain James Bond joining us. So, hello everyone, greetings from Jakarta. Now, okay, so I know that your parents smoke because I met your mother, Iris, right? And it was socially acceptable then. You were saying that
Yeah.
the photo with everyone with a cigarette in it. Now, do you think if your parents didn't, it would have made a difference to you, or was it just a case, of your mates doing it and it was easy access at that time?
Mm. Um, the interesting thing is, growing up, I was very, very much anti-smoking, and I think that kind of stemmed from the education that I had at school.
Right,
That was, smoking is bad and is terrible for you, and you shouldn't smoke. And so the education system was very strong on that. And then I'd have this issue where I'd come home and both my parents were smoking, and my neighbors and my family. And I'm sure some of the teachers who were telling me it's a bad thing were also smoking. In fact, I know some of them were.
right,
Um, and it was socially acceptable. And my parents went through a period of um, really being very difficult with me and very strong at me about me not smoking. And they made it a real, real big deal about, I shouldn't be a smoker. And I wasn't until I was 18 or something like that. And then I went to college, and, the old cliche, I fell in with the bad crowd, and I got discovered by my parents smoking. And at that stage, they couldn't really say to me,
right,
you can't smoke, you shouldn't be a smoker, because it wasn't that they'd encouraged it. It's just that
mm,
they were doing it regularly on a daily basis. In fact, I remember, you know, going to the store on my family's behalf and buying cigarettes for them
for the
and
family.
for family. And at that point, then, it was a gray area. If you
Right,
received a little letter from your parents or from your relatives, can this person purchase cigarettes on behalf of
right,
me? The store owner would give you the cigarettes. And I
right.
look back at that and I'm like, that was just a terrible thing to allow,
Right. And it was like,
Yeah.
cigarettes with bread and milk.
Yes. Essentially what it was like. Yeah.
Now, okay. Now then I'm going to move on to China because you spent a few years in China as well, right?
Mm,
And I can't remember what, like, this will be the last decade. Well, no, in the 2000 onwards, you were in China for a couple of years, right?
yeah.
And I can imagine that as well there.
Oh,
Then I don't know what the situation is. So how did you manage the smoking population and what was experienced with that?
I think the first time I went to China was around 2004 or 2005, something like that. And when I discovered just how cheap cigarettes were, because they're a state-sponsored commodity, so they are incredibly cheap. And again, the joke is that you can never see daylight in sunlight rather in
Right,
Beijing
right.
because of pollution. And I'm guessing
Mm,
that a lot of that is not just because of the factories and the cars and whatever. It's because the whole population at that time
right,
were smokers. A huge amount of people in China. I think it's the world's biggest smoking population. It's enormous, and everybody was smoking. You go to weddings, and
mm,
the grooms are encouraged to smoke and to come around the table with the special packets of cigarettes, to share with you. And that's kind of supposed to be some kind of blessing for their marriage if you
right,
partake in a cigarette with the groom. And it was just everywhere you went, Frida. The bars. I would see people walk into elevators with a cigarette.
right. And so this is from the UK to China, seeing all
Yeah.
this, right? Okay, now I know you haven't been back there in a while, not to
Mm.
my knowledge, but do you know if things have changed? Talking to your friends and all
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah. They have. I know back in around, excuse me, 2015, Beijing in particular, brought in a whole bunch of ordinances that were certain places had to be certified 100% smoke free. Kindergartens, historic sites, cultural sites, public transportation, that kind of thing. And then they moved on to integrating WeChat. So what they had was that they had this whole thing where WeChat, as you know, is a super app that you can order food on, you can pay things on. But what they also did on behalf of the Beijing Tobacco Control Association was that you could report people that were smoking in certain places.
Big Brother's watching.
So Big Brother was watching, but it was more of a case of Big Brother, sister, cousin, auntie, uncle were watching, and if you were caught, they would report you if you were smoking in these places. And so that whole idea of using society to kind of add pressure to an existing problem and
Right.
try and solve that issue together, I think is very interesting, but a little bit dangerous also, because you don't know if people are just reporting you for the sake of it, or if they're reporting businesses just for the sake of it because they may have a different agenda. But I do know that from 2015 to 2018, there are around 25,000 reported violations within Beijing.
Wow. Okay. And I would think that would be a day.
Yes.
Right? Not per year, per day. Now, okay, I'm going to go back to UK, and I know you haven't been home for a few years for obvious reasons, but the data showed that the UK has seen a reduction from 17% in 2015 to 14% in 2019. So, 3% is huge. Now, have you seen this in reality when you went back? Do you know if your mates have ceased smoking?
Yeah, I know a lot of them have, and I know I have relatives that have ceased smoking as well, for numerous reasons, health reasons. That some of them are obviously they're not as young as they used to be. They're not indestructible like they think they are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's also been this growing awareness of like there are other options available, and I say that because I think the way in which smokers are looked at can be a
Right.
bit difficult sometimes.
Right.
People say it's a habit, and I think if anybody has smoked, yes, it's a habit, but more of it's an addiction more than anything. And I think that awareness of realizing that it's an addiction that needs to be treated rather than a habit that can just be instantly stopped, I think is a bigger conversation that a lot of people have or should be having.
Okay, we've got a comment here, but I'll get to that a little later. It says from George Wee, say, well, organizations are advocating the bad side of smoking. The government are collecting high taxes from it. How else do we do to educate the younger generation? Well, like we don't. Well, we'll talk about it. We'll give our thoughts around it, but we'll get to that a little later, right? And you said that yes, you've seen your friends sort of seize that. And what were some of the cultural pushbacks that had to be worked through? I guess like one of those things where it stopped being acceptable. What were some of the things they did right?
I mean, we're discussing sustainable cities and communities and that kind of thing. And the pub was the community for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And a lot of those older people, who used the pub were smokers, and that they saw that as the hub of their community. And they could no longer go to that place where they've been going, some of them 40 and 50 years. To be social and to speak to their friends. And they could no longer do that because they couldn't do that in the way in which they'd been used to. You had areas where, the UK is not the warmest of places, Frida, particularly winter. And so these people, they're getting on a bit, 60, 70, 80, and they would have to go outside to have a cigarette or smoke their pipe or whatever within these specific areas. And so that was a real issue that for a lot of people took a while to get used to. And you would see New Year's Eve is a prime example. It was freezing cold. You would see people outside wearing their best outfits and often hardly anything because it's a New Year's Eve, shivering to death as they're smoking a cigarette outside. So that took some time. But
not a problem here. Not a problem here.
We don't
have a weather issue, right?
Not a problem
other than it's raining.
Yeah, so that I think that was the kind of major pushback. It was about how some of these pubs that have been around for so long, not only did they have to ban smoking inside, but
Mm,
when they did create a place outside, it had to be a designated smoking
right.
area. It had to be
Whoa.
it had to be a particular size. It
Mm,
had to have heating. It had to have ventilation, and so it was a huge cost for a lot of these
right.
buildings. It became a difficult transition, I think.
Right. Okay. Initially, and now sort of, maybe the expectations aren't as high. I don't know what the rules are. Do people still? I guess in urban planning and sustainable,
Mm.
are they still planning for that? You would, I guess, you would
I,
agree.
I think less so. I
Right.
think what they plan for when available, if they have space, is what we call a beer garden, an
Mm,
outdoor space where people can congregate. And it's in some of these areas, in a particular area, where smokers can kind of congregate if they need to and have a cigarette outside. But yes, less and less, it's becoming part of the planning process, if at all, I think.
okay. And hi, Teresa. How are the younger ones responding? And I sort of like, to this new normal, right? I guess what can we in Malaysia learn from it is it because they're not seeing their parents doing it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's exactly that. And what George has asked about, how else could we educate the younger generation to stay away from smoking? It does start with the people that you look up to, your teachers, your parents, your family members, aunt and uncle. If you don't see it, it doesn't become, part of your behavior. It doesn't
Right.
become part of something that you mimic. And I
Right.
think because we're not seeing that at all, and the younger people are not seeing people smoking for the most part in public,
Right.
then that's really, really helped these numbers to come down. I mean, 17 to 14% might not seem a lot, but
Mm.
in the UK, which for the longest time has had a high percentage of smokers,
Yes.
it's quite dramatic.
Right, right. And hi, Erasmus. Thanks for joining us. Okay, now, of course, here in Malaysia, I'm bringing you closer to home, your new
Mhm.
home. When you arrived, I think you were still smoking and non smoking areas in restaurants, right? And then it became a complete no in
Yeah.
restaurants. So, what do you think of that move, making it more difficult? Does this serve its purpose of reducing people from smoking?
hmm I think it was a great move. And I know there was a huge pushback for a while, but
Yes.
then when you look at the long term effects of it and how, um, in general, it's affecting people's public health,
Mm,
it's something that even though I think when I first, when I first got here, I was a smoker,
mm,
and it was for me an irritant because
mm,
I've lived in Asia for so long, and it was almost like, well, Asia is one of those places where smokers are not necessarily welcomed or encouraged,
mm.
but not discouraged so much. And I think it was a welcome change to see bars, nightclubs, restaurants, mamaks
Right,
giving people who didn't smoke the ability to go outside and breathe freely, perhaps for the first time in forever,
right.
and enjoy their meal without going home stinking of smoke.
Right. So, okay, so this is what you've noticed in your own behavior of the years. You become an old man, Richard.
Yes.
You become sensible in your old age.
Well, yes,
I can
yeah,
say because we're about, well,
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot more anyway. Okay, so now I know countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore are quite strict, right, when it comes to these things. However, do you think being smoke-free is the way forward in terms of alternative options that are smokeless?
Hmm. I think I kind of sit on the fence on this, and the reason I sit on the fence is because obviously I am have been a smoker, and
Mm,
I still have a nicotine craving,
mm,
and I
mm,
find using a vape or alternative methods kind of negate that craving, and depending on what the long-term usage is of vapes, I know that it's still out there, and it's still up for debate. um, but I think banning it entirely is probably a step. I don't know. Is it a step too far? No, I don't. I don't think it is. I mean, and this goes back to what we just discussed earlier about
mm.
if you don't see it, it doesn't become top of mind. But
Right.
then as well as I do, excuse me, if something is banned outright,
Mm,
people will always find a way to do that thing that is banned outright, whether or not you agree with it or not.
right.
And so you have the potential of driving this kind of behavior underground, this need underground. And if the idea is to do it, to create this ban to people of a certain age and of a certain generation, then it makes sense.
Right.
Absolutely makes sense.
Right.
And I think that's the way to go. But to just suddenly decide that a particular city or a particular area of a city can no longer have smoking in there, I don't know where I sit with that, because there are still people out there who smoke and cannot, if they've tried to stop and perhaps cannot.
Which
I don't
brings
know.
right, which brings me to that conversation. The Ministry of Health talks about the end game when those born in 2005 won't have access to nicotine, regardless in whatever form, right?
Mhm.
So your views on this? Will it work? Will it not? If not, what other areas do you think we've overlooked to make it a success? You say if from a certain age, those born a
Yeah.
certain age, you think there is a chance of it
I think
changing?
I think it absolutely will. I mean, and just to go back to what we were saying about those numbers dropping in the UK, I know for a fact that vaping is one of those things where the GPs in the UK have suggested it as a useful way to help with smoking cessation, and to a degree encourage it rather than smoking. They say they don't say it's healthier than smoking. They say there are fewer risks associated so far that they are aware of than
Right.
smoking.
Right.
And of my friends that have taken to using a vape or an e-cigarette or whatever, they no longer take tobacco at all, and so I see that as being an encouraging development. Now, will it work? I think it will. But I also think that as I mentioned earlier on, you need to treat smokers not just as people who have habits. You need to treat them as addicts to a
Right.
degree and
Right.
address it as an addiction.
Right.
And so with addiction, there needs to be the correct treatment.
Right.
And I know there are people out there who will say, these people chose to become smokers. And yeah, you're probably right. They probably did. And you might also say, well, if they chose to do that, they don't necessarily deserve to be given free treatment because it's a decision they made of their own volition. But they're addicts.
Right.
How do you treat an addict for a problem? And I think that's something that is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, because we were just saying, like, will people look at other forms of addiction? I don't know. I mean, I think of Amsterdam, right, for
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
right, and it seems that it's just the tourists that take
Yeah.
advantage of these things, and it's not so much, I don't hear the locals doing it, right? So, and you earn revenues from, but that's a conversation for another day.
Hmm.
Okay, now what would be then your picture of a sustainable city and community? And don't sing Imagine to me.
Um, I mean, I grew up in a small village in a small town, and the thing for me that you
Name of a
know
cigarette, actually.
actually, yes, the name of
Mm,
a brand of a cigarette.
mm,
I look at things like um, good career and business opportunities,
right,
and
right,
the idea of safe and affordable housing. Affordable housing is the one thing that I really would like to see a push for. And
right,
but at the end of that, the big thing that I would love to see is a good public transportation system.
right.
Um,
Okay.
and I know in KL it's almost like a pipe dream. It feels like a pipe dream. When I first got here and I realized that there were very few pavements, and everything was a road. You got the road and then the house at the side of it, and very few pavements in
Right.
some parts of town. I just couldn't get my head around it. You
Okay.
know, the idea that I couldn't walk from certain parts of the city to another without having to go through a mall
Right.
and then go over a bridge, and then I just couldn't walk on a pavement somewhere. And
Okay.
then getting out of the MRT or the LRT, and there being no way of getting from that space to another space without it being extremely difficult, no kind of last mile transportation. That's
Right.
what I really like to see, and,
Right.
and just the idea of community is created by being able to move around freely,
Okay.
and get to places that you perhaps wouldn't normally get to.
Right.
Um,
So
yeah,
that's your thing, transportation,
I
and of
think
course,
so.
Yeah, so transportation and easy moving. Well, it's work in progress, Richard.
Affordable housing, Frida. I think
Yeah,
that's the big one for Malaysia. We know how many houses we have free. We know how many developments we have on a daily, weekly, monthly basis,
right.
and yet the pricing is always just
A little out of reach for your average Joe, right?
yeah. But then
Uh,
again, that's a conversation for a different day and a different
a
topic.
different topic. And of course, as you're talking about sustainable cities, and as you live in the city, apart from transportation, of course, we'd like to be able to breathe freely as well,
Yeah.
and all that. So thanks, Rich. It's been
Hey,
great.
pleasure.
Anything else you want to add? This is what we always do in our job.
I mean,
Any final words, Richard?
when I remember traveling to, I lived in Greece for a while as well,
Ah,
and
okay, I missed that.
I remember on the first day that I got there, and I was ordering a gyros, which is like a Greek kebab,
Right.
and I remember looking at the guy preparing my gyros, and yeah, and he'd got a cigarette hanging from his mouth with the ash about to drop as
Right,
he's preparing my food,
right.
and I think at that point. I was so disgusted by the whole thing, and just how it had pervaded society
Right,
that really made me change my perception of how acceptable smoking should be within cities.
right.
And that really, really did make me think, that I'd been raised a certain way. I'd seen all these things a certain way, and I did not want to see that anymore. From that point on, yeah, it changed everything.
Right. Be exciting times as we, move forward, and, hopefully we'll achieve the sustainable city and community, at least here in Kuala Lumpur, right? I mean, we'll
Yeah,
start with the big ones as well. So on that note, thank you very much for your time, Richard. I'll see you in a couple of
pleasure.
hours tomorrow morning anyway.
Yes, you will indeed.
thank, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found this interesting. And then, Richard, thank you, really seriously. Your perspective, having growing up in a different country, seeing things from China, from Greece, from right down here to Malaysia, it gives us a lot of perspective. So bye everyone, I'll see you tomorrow.